Welcome to my talk on the social and emotional dimensions of security and privacy user engagement. This is joint work with my awesome co-authors, Verena Zimmermann, Alexandra von Preuschen, and Renaud. So we all know that despite all of our efforts, users still struggle to adopt security and privacy protection measures. And reasons for this include, for example, a lack of awareness, a lack of skills, misconceptions about the efficiency of such tools, or a lack of motivation. However, we know from recent research that what reinforces all of these barriers are negative emotions that cause avoidance of the topic. So security and privacy are associated with fear, frustration, uncertainty, and because of that, security and privacy measures are often experienced as overwhelming, leading to disengagement with the topic. So to address this, our first goal is to increase enjoyment, and we want to identify strategies that make security and privacy more engaging for that. We also know that social dynamics are closely tied to emotions. Recent research has shown that social cues can raise awareness and prompt secure actions. However, security and privacy topics are rarely discussed among non-experts. So our second goal is to facilitate social interaction on the topic. Our research questions are, how can security and privacy be made more enjoyable, and on what positive attributes can we build on? And the second research question is, what facilitates social interactions on security and privacy? For this, we conducted a qualitative and quantitative survey study with a representative US sample, which we recruited on Prolific, of around 500 participants. And we used sentence completion tasks such as, privacy is a topic that, it would be so much more fun to protect my privacy if, to imagine that if privacy was a person, what character traits they would use to describe this person, and to indicate their perceived level of privacy protection on a Likert type scale. We then repeated these questions for security, then focused on conversations by asking how often they talked about security and privacy topics with others and why. And again, used a sentence completion task, that is, I would talk about security or privacy respectively much more often with others if. We then explored how stereotypes might shape social interactions on the topic, and asked whether participants associated certain security and privacy protection measures with paranoia, and used the Neurogenius scale. And we finished with capturing demographic variables, including, for example, security and privacy skills, security intention, privacy literacy. We found that users mostly perceive security and privacy as highly important, but not as necessarily interesting. So, for example, our participants said, security is really uncool, but really important. Not surprisingly, the topic was also perceived as complex and overwhelming. For example, it invokes fear and concern, and it sounds scary. Security especially was experienced as something that participants are not familiar with. So, for example, they said, I know very little about it, and it is relatively foreign to me. Privacy, on the other hand, was described as a controversial and thus sensitive topic. So, for example, it can be polarizing and difficult to discuss openly. Our participants highlighted that security and privacy both deserve more attention. So, for example, security gets a lot of publicity, but not enough attention, and if we are not willing to talk openly about privacy, we will continue to lose it. When asked to imagine that if security and privacy respectively was a person, namely a colleague of them, which character traits they would use to describe this person, participants mostly named positive character traits such as trustworthy, reliable, honest, good, and helpful. Security was more often perceived as intelligent, and hence a topic that warrants expertise and knowledge. Both were described as strong and secure, and participants also frequently mentioned neutral traits. For example, privacy was described as introverted, discreet, and secretive, and security as quiet and changing. We also had some negative responses. For example, privacy was described as complicated, hypercritical and unreliable, and security also as complicated, boring, and suspicious. But most responses were positively. So when asked how we can make security and privacy more fun, most participants stressed that we first need to reduce the complexity. So, for example, it would be more fun if it was not so complicated. And likewise, participants said that they needed more knowledge on the topic. So, for example, it would be more fun to protect my security if I learned more about it. Participants also said that we need to enhance the accessibility, either in terms of time that is required, but also in terms of money. So, for example, it would be more fun if it was free or inexpensive. And participants said that they needed more self-efficacy, a feeling that they were actually accomplishing something. So, for example, it would be more fun if there was tangible proof that my efforts kept my data secure. Some participants said that they needed to relinquish the responsibility in order to have more fun. So, for example, if governments and internet providers did more to secure the internet, and others said that we needed to reframe the topic to have a more positive connotation. So, for example, if it was not talked about in such a doomsday way. Especially in the organizational context, participants also highlighted the role of incentives. So, for example, it would be more fun if we got cake every month there were no breaches. And although a minority, some participants also said that the topic, both security and privacy, would be too serious to be considered fun. So, for example, I think when it comes to protecting my privacy that it shouldn't be a matter of fun. Others said that it can never be fun. There is no pathway that it would ever be experienced as fun. So, for example, I can't imagine a way it would be fun. Moving to the social level, this is how participants rated their level of security and privacy protection compared to their peers and family. Most participants rated themselves as above average, as slightly better than their partner and as much better than their children, siblings, friends, and acquaintances. Parents were consistently rated as the least culpable in both categories. Participants reported to not talk frequently about security and privacy topics with others, and common reasons for this were the lack of relevant conversation starters, the perceived complexity of the topic, and disinterest from others. Interestingly, most participants said that they themselves would indeed be interested to talk about the topic, but mainly no one else was. So when asked on how can we foster security and privacy conversations, most participants said that we first needed to close knowledge gaps for this, either of others. So for example, I would talk more often about the topic with others if they could relate. Sometimes they don't understand what I'm talking about, or their own knowledge gaps. So for example, if I knew more about the topic, I would talk more often about it. Again, participants said that others need to be more interested in the topic. So for example, if others were as interested in the subject as me, I would talk more often about it. While other participants highlighted social norms of not bringing these topics up. So for example, I would talk about privacy more often if it wasn't taboo. Again, participants said that they needed more agency to feel more in control. So for example, just talking about it without being able to do anything is just stressful. And others directly hinted at a need for conversation triggers. So for example, if there was some sort of catalyst in the news or media to talk about it. When asked how they perceive certain security and privacy protection measures in terms of paranoia, we found that most participants did not perceive individuals who follow basic security practices, such as using antivirus software or updating devices, as paranoid. However, privacy protection measures such as covering device cameras, avoiding social media, or reading privacy policies were more likely to be viewed as paranoid. We also applied the nerd genius scale, which includes traits associated with both geniuses and nerds. And we found that participants who actively protect their security and privacy were mostly associated with genius traits, such as intelligence and computer obsession, which again highlights that security and privacy is perceived as a topic for experts. From the nerd scale, the trait introvert got the highest level of agreement, but less than 25%. So to conclude, security and privacy is perceived as negative, but as important. And to foster a more positive engagement, we could, for example, rely on storytelling, social prompts, or incentives. And we need to enhance self-efficacy, for example, by highlighting security measures such as using multi-factor authentication as an empowering choice rather than a mandatory task. We found that people do not talk about security and privacy due to perceived disinterest and social taboos, and we could perhaps embed conversation triggers and work routines to address this. We found that security is perceived as intelligent, while privacy is perceived as paranoid, and to shift cultural norms and organizational norms, we for example, could increase privacy visibility. In the organizational context, we need management support and a strong error culture to overcome fears of engaging with the topic. And our findings suggest that people might be overly optimistic regarding their protection levels. And in order to recalibrate, we could rely on social password meters or display security measures of peers. Okay, so here are the key takeaways again. We need to reframe security and privacy, especially increase self-efficacy. We need to create social exchange, and we need to challenge privacy stereotypes around paranoia. You can download the paper here. Please feel free to reach out, and I'm now happy to take questions.